clicked the guest thing instead of UT only, and I double checked it. But why don't we get started this afternoon? I want to welcome everyone to City Forum for the 2021 academic year. City Forum is the colloquium event series, the Community Regional Planning Program here at the University of Texas at Austin. And this year, Brittany Faulkner is my collaborator, is the research assistant for City Forum. We have 5 events scheduled for this fall, and we've put out the schedule. But if you have any questions or need the schedule, feel free to contact either Brittany or myself. Normally, of course, we would be in Goldsmith Hall having snacks, but alas, this fall we're going to be virtual for the entire fall. Nonetheless, we have a really amazing first speaker to launch off City Forum for this year, Sam Stein. Sam made a kind of stunning debut in the economic and geography and planning world with his book, Capital City Gentrification and the Real Estate State. And in this book, he reminds us, sort of reflecting back on Richard Fogelson's Planning in the Capital City, that planning and urban policy is intrinsically embedded in a dynamic and rapidly changing political economy of capitalism, which currently has maybe a historically uniquely historic role for real estate in all of its manifestations and global real estate in all of its manifestations. Another amazing thing is that Sam really produced this path-breaking book, which is on like almost everyone's reading list these days, while he was still a PhD student. Sam's currently a housing analyst at the City of New York, and maybe he can tell us a little bit more about that later. But I could say a lot more things. He's produced not his book, but other really incredible work. But without any further ado, live from New York, let me introduce Sam Stein.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Great. It's really an honor to be here for the City Forum series. I want to thank Michael Oden and Brittany Faulkner for inviting me and facilitating this, and Michael for that kind introduction. I'm really sorry I can't be in Austin with you all right now. My older brother actually graduated from UT Austin about 15 years ago, so I was in the city then, and would love to be back, but happy to do it this way. I will admit that it's been like 5 months and I'm still not great at this, so I will do my best in this Zoom climate to make this interesting. But I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate you all tuning in. I really look forward to your questions. I will talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I don't know how we're going to moderate that, but whatever it is, I'm sure it'll be great. So as Michael said, I recently graduated from the geography PhD program at the City University of New York Graduate Center. I'm working now as a housing policy analyst for the Community Service Society of New York, which is about a 150-year-old nonprofit organization fighting for policy that works for low-income New Yorkers. So I transitioned from academia back into the world of politics, messy as it is. And maybe I can get into some of what's going on right now in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do with this talk is, in the first half, present some of the key findings from my book, Capital City, which looks at the concentration of capital into real estate through the perspective of urban planning. And then in the second half, present some of the key findings from my dissertation, which is a separate work which looks at the same phenomena of real estate and planning, but from the perspective of New York City's unions and nonprofits. This analysis is therefore pre-pandemic, or for biblically oriented folks, BC, before COVID. I'll do my best to insert updates here and there, but I'd really love to, in the Q&A, talk about what has changed in the last few months and what hasn't around the issues that I'm bringing up here. So first, let's talk about what I call the real estate state. Housing in New York, housing in the United States has been a crisis for low-income people for a very long time, arguably permanently. That's the case that David Madden and Peter Marcuse made in their recent book, In Defense of Housing. While there's a more generalized housing affordability crisis right now, there's basically a permanent housing crisis for the poor in the US. The dynamics right now, though, have some historically peculiar and significant features. In the US, again, until COVID, pre-COVID, homes were changing hands at a rapid pace, but home ownership was at a 50-year low. In 2016, the US set a record of 37% of home sales made to absentee investors. And while some of those are pensioners looking for a retirement strategy, renting out a second home, a large portion of them were bought by banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms, most notoriously Blackstone, the private equity firm that is now the world's largest landlord. And as renting was rising, so did rents. Average move-in rents, so the rent of a vacant apartment in the US, have more than doubled over the last 2 decades, while wages have remained stagnant, particularly for the bottom half of the income pool, which then puts tenants in a bind, right? Rents are going up, incomes are flat. That means people are paying out more and more of their income in rent. And we call that the rent burden, the percentage of income tenants put toward housing. It's become oppressive, more or less universally, and in hot cities as well as cool real estate markets, low-income people are paying really insane percentages of their income in rent. Nationally, it's something like 32 or 33% is the average rent burden, which is considered unaffordable. The Housing and Urban Development Department says an affordable rent is 30% of your income. So already most tenants are paying unaffordable rents. It's also, like many things in this country, highly racially stratified. So if we assume neighborhoods are segregated, and sadly we can assume that, in predominantly white neighborhoods, the average rent burden is 31%, already unaffordable. In predominantly Black neighborhoods, it's 44%, and in predominantly Latino, it's 48%. So that means a lot of people are paying almost half of their incomes in rent. Plenty of people are paying more than half of their income in rent. In New York City, we have 2 million people paying to their landlord more than half of what they're bringing in. You can imagine that as a gigantic cash flow from your boss to your landlord that you never get to see or keep. So with wages flat, many people, even those with full-time jobs, simply can't afford stable housing. And so we've seen homelessness take off, especially family homelessness. Last year, although that's a little old, 2 years ago, an estimated 2 million people in the US went homeless at some point, and an additional 7 million more people lived in precarious housing conditions, meaning doubled or tripled up, couch surfing, or even sleeping in something called a shift bed, which was a feature of the US housing landscape in the Industrial Revolution that's come back now, which is where you don't rent an apartment, you don't rent a room, you don't even rent a bed in a room, you rent a bed for a few hours and then pass it on to another person who comes in and sleeps for a while. We can step in now with our post-pandemic COVID lens and see just how dangerous a situation that is, and see very clearly the connection between access to housing and access to space and health. So there's a lot of ways of explaining these phenomena in this housing crunch. The most dominant explanations are, first, a mismatch of supply and demand, meaning there is simply not enough housing in the places people want to live compared to the number of people who want to live there. To which I say, true, especially true if we say there is not a supply of housing at the rents that are, affordable to the people of low incomes who are demanding them, right? So it makes more sense in a rent and income stratified sense than in a generalized sense, but still, fine. The second major explanation is a kind of cultural explanation that there's been a demographic shift in preferences where younger people maybe in the past would have seen it as aspirational to move out of cities and into the suburbs, now see it as aspirational to move from the suburbs back into the cities. And this has to do with cultural preferences. It has to do with two income earning households. It has to do with gas prices and transit options. It has to do with environmental consciousness, all sorts of other things. To which I also say, true, there is a demographic shift and there are changing cultural preferences. My emphasis in my book, Capital City, is not so much to say that neither of those things are true, but to say that there's a third factor, which is kind of an elephant in the room, which is another form of supply and demand, but specifically, there is a surplus of capital in real estate and rather than a net deficit of housing as such. There is a ton of money that has been put into the real estate sector expecting a quick return, and this causes housing prices to inflate. So this can be understood as a question of supply and demand as well, but of something quite different than the dominant explanation. There is an oversupply of speculative real estate capital and an incredibly high demand for high and fast return investment vehicles. This too is driving the rapid inflation of housing prices in cities rich and poor throughout the country and really around the world. So if we want to measure that concentration of capital into real estate, I just realized I didn't start my timer, so I'm going to do that. We can see through UN reports and other places that global real estate is valued at historically high levels. The number in a recent report was $217 trillion, which is one of these numbers that's so unfathomably high that it's essentially meaningless, but I'll repeat it, $217 trillion, which you can think of as the value of all the gold that's ever been mined throughout history, everywhere in the world, pooled into one central place, multiplied by 36. That's the value of real estate right now. It makes up 60% of the world's hard assets, the vast majority of which is in housing. So that's another historic shift, which Piketty and others have written about. There have been other times when real estate was the dominant investment strategy, but it was often agricultural real estate or potentially industrial real estate, owning land for a purpose of developing some other thing on that land. This is a historically significant thing that 75% of global real estate investment is in housing rather than agriculture or industry, 3/4. There are a number of reasons why capital is converging on land and buildings at this time in history. We can point to, in the US and in several other countries, a long period of financial deregulation, which enabled banks to put their money into speculative housing vehicles much more easily, and with great consequence allowed them to bundle mortgages together, package them as investment vehicles, and then sell them off in pieces to investors around the world, including individual investors, but most importantly, institutional investors, which probably includes anyone that has a pension or a 401k, as well as insurance or any other large pool of capital. We also had a long period of low federal interest rates, which looked like it might be moving in the other direction, but probably isn't, which a lot of labor groups will argue is a good thing, and in many ways is, but created incentives to move money out of other traditional forms of investment and into real estate, because those other forms of investment weren't moving very fast and the cost of borrowing was incredibly low, which made it easier for these big pools of capital to amass and then be put toward real estate with the expectation of a fast and big return. We also had this whole period of quantitative easing in the United States, which transferred tremendous amounts of kind of imaginary capital from the Treasury into the banks, who then put it into real estate, among other things. We've seen massive urbanization programs in several spots in the world, which have been kind of magnets for global capital. We've seen, ghost cities emerge in China, cities being built long before there's demand for the housing there. The United Arab Emirates was building out at an enormous clip, Turkey, many other places. And that became a spur for more real estate investment generally globally. There was a proliferation of private equity funds, pools of money that are scouring the globe for what they consider to be undervalued investment opportunities, and then finding them in housing. And it's worth noting that after 2008, as I mentioned before, a lot of the single family home stock that went into foreclosure, went on short sale, was bought up by firms like Blackstone. But it's also multifamily housing, and specifically affordable multifamily rental housing that got bought up by some of these firms. So in New York City, where I'm speaking to you from, predatory equity firms, as we like to call them, were buying up two especially forms of affordable housing. One is rent-controlled housing, under the assumption that they could buy it and skirt the law and raise the rents anyway, and basically deregulate the buildings. And the other, a form of subsidized housing known as Mitchell-Lama, named after the sponsors of the legislation that created it, which were, again, bought under the assumption that they could get out of the regulatory agreement and make the affordable housing less affordable. So that's another reason why we've seen capital rush into real estate and make these big profits. We've also seen a generalized economic polarization around the world, with extremely wealthy and somewhat nervous individuals viewing property as the safest place to hide their money, and global cities as a way of diversifying their investment portfolio. So they'll buy, condos in New York, as well as Vancouver, as well as Sao Paulo, as well as Mumbai, to spread out the risk pool and hide money from, taxes or wherever else, and many more reasons on top of all this. The net movement is that capital gains are rising, the rate of profit off of previous investments, while the rate of profit in sort of traditional sectors of the economy are decreasing. So that's kind of like the Robert Brenner argument about the long-term trend in capitalism toward a decreasing rate of return on profit over time. But with this added twist that some sectors of the economy, and real estate most definitely being one of them, are becoming more and more profitable for speculators. So viewed in that light, we see all those trends that I talked about before as a reflection of this growing centrality of capital into real estate. I argue that there's a political manifestation of this change as well as an economic one, and one in the lives of tenants around the country and around the world, which is what I call the rise of the real estate state, a phrase some people think is elegant and other people think is ugly. But it's meant to be kind of a new term in the long line of people saying the such and such state. We're familiar with the terms the welfare state to talk about the element of the state that's interested in providing a social safety net. People talk about the warfare state in terms of the element of the state that's interested in promoting militarism. We've heard a lot about the carceral state as the combination of police and prisons that is an increasingly powerful force in both political and economic terms in the US. The real estate state is yet another formation that is a tendency or a block that's been around for a very long time. I think you can go back historically and find elements of a real estate state as long as there's been states and private property, essentially. What's relatively new is that this is a very powerful interest in more and more national, but especially local states. So what I'm talking about is the element of the state that's interested in using government power to increase the value of land and property and to make real estate a more profitable venture. And so as real estate values have risen to absurd heights, so is the political force of real estate capital. Which brings us to city planning, which is what brought all of us here into this Zoom room. Planners manage the levers of urban change and make crucial decisions about land use, transportation, housing, and the environment. And in most places, they are tasked with a fundamentally contradictory goal of safeguarding residents' best interests while simultaneously inflating real estate values. And while there's a lot of, I would say, ideological rhetoric that says these two things can be compatible, it's really hard to sell that to a tenant who's paying more than 30%, let alone more than 50% of their income and rent as their property value, their landlord's property values are going through the roof. So city planners are very much uncomfortably in the middle of this. Very few city planners get into this job because they want to be involved in the so-called real estate state. I think almost all of us are attracted to planning for the opposite reason, that we want to create better, safer, more affordable, cleaner, more environmentally sustainable spaces. Our interests are not in making our cities unaffordable to the people we care about, and yet that is very much what is expected of us, both because of the political power of real estate and the way that our cities have become increasingly dependent on the real estate industry as a dominant tax base and as a key so-called stakeholder in any other kind of plan that city planning departments are pushing through. So if I step back a little bit, there's a long historical analysis of planning in the US, the kind of the best and the worst elements, and how we got to the moment we're in. There's a lot I could say about that element of the book, but I want to focus on one portion of it in particular, which is the role of deindustrialization in all of this. So Michael Oden mentioned Richard Fogelsong's book, Planning the Capitalist City, which if you haven't read already, I highly recommend. It's a history of planning in the US from the colonial era through the 1920s. And in the introduction, Fogelsong makes the case that planning is always contradictory in a capitalist context, and specifically that there are two contradictions that became to the fore historically in the US around questions of planning and property. So the first he calls the property contradiction. It's essentially that private landowners need state planning intervention in order to make their businesses possible, but really bristle at the idea that anyone can tell them what to do with the land that they own. So a landowner, whatever their business operation, does not really have much of a value proposition if there isn't public planning in the form of infrastructure development especially, but also coordination, budgetary allocations, and the social reproduction of the labor force, which is to say, investing in some of the most important things that city planners monitor, such as housing, such as healthcare, such as education, that produce the very workforce that landowners depend on to make their operations functional. What he notes, though, is that different kinds of landowners have different kinds of demands on the state. And he breaks it down crudely but usefully into real estate capital and manufacturing capital. And he says, manufacturing capital, for example, hates environmental regulation. They don't want to be told what they can do where. They may be interested, however, in certain forms of housing interventions, rent control or public housing that makes housing cheaper for their workforce. Because as they see it, if housing is cheaper for their workforce, their workers aren't going to need such high wages, which then decreases the pressure on them as employers. Real estate interests might have the exact opposite sets of demands, right? They don't like rent control. They don't like public housing. They don't like anything that's a threat to their business model. There are, of course, caveats to that, but as a general rule. They might like some forms of environmental regulation, however, which might clean up brownfields and make new spaces available for development, or might make the land that they own a much more pleasant place to live in, and therefore the property values rise. So there's this conflict between capitalists, even as they're struggling over this question of just how much planning do we want. The way that planners resolve that contradiction leads to the second one that Fogelsong mentions, which he calls the capitalist democracy contradiction, which is to say that we do exist in a formal democracy. Voters have a say in how things are going to go, and planners are appointed by elected officials. And so as planners are trying to sort of give the capitalists what they need in order to bring them to their cities or keep them in place, they also have to care a lot about what the working class residents of their city, who by definition are a majority, think about what they're doing. And so they have to, please the people as they're appeasing the owners. And this leads to the development of the semi-democratic planning norms that we're familiar with, as in a public comment period where the public is welcome to come and say what they think about a proposal. That proposal, however, has probably already been vetted with the landowners that it would affect, may have even been drafted by them in the first place, and will be decided by a board of people who historically have had a great deal of business side interests in the form of planning commissions. So it creates the opportunity for just enough democracy to give the system validity without threatening the kind of fundamental needs of the owners of land and capital in the city. That's Fogelsong's analysis. I happen to think it's a really good one. Simplified as it is, in that he's considering like 250 years of history, I still think it tells us a lot about how planning works in a capitalist democracy. His analysis, however, ends in 1920s. So a lot has happened since then. 100 years have happened since then. And among the things that have happened since then, I think one of the most salient is what gets called deindustrialization, but would be probably better described as a geographic redistribution of industrial production. So the world gets more industrial, but many central cities become less industrial or less factory oriented. This starts in a first wave in the US after World War II, as some manufacturing leaves the cities for the surrounding suburbs and to some extent into the south. That direction picks up in the 70s and 80s, and by the 90s, a lot of firms are leaving the US altogether and heading for special economic zones south of the border or in the east or other developing countries. And so a whole lot of cities' political economy got completely rewritten during that period over the course of those 2 or 3 waves. And this had a tremendous effect on the practice of urban planning, which I argue leads to the rise of the real estate state. So if we think about that property contradiction, the whole thing was kind of premised on not only there being a conflict between what landowners want and what they need, but also a conflict between different types of landowners. If you remove that conflict because industrial capital has fled the city, such that they're still a force, but in most US cities, they're not the dominant political force anymore, that kind of leaves a tremendous vacuum for real estate to expand and grow. And suddenly you don't have this element of capital that, for example, was interested in some form of housing protections for low-income workers. If you think about the capitalist democracy contradiction, you suddenly have a situation where it's not just sort of capital in the aggregate that's needs are being balanced against the needs of popular democracy, but specifically the real estate sector, which grows to have increasing influence over the planning field in general. And so these conflicts are increasingly resolved in favor of real estate capital. And we can think of it as I said briefly, as real estate filling the industrial vacuum. And I think that that's a useful way of thinking about what gentrification actually is in political economic terms. It's not just the return of rich people into cities, though it is also that. It is real estate growing as a central actor in cities' politics and planning. So if we think a bit about it in political terms, that means that there's less of a conflict between multiple modes of capital with different claims on the state, and instead this kind of one big elephant in the room in the form of real estate. In economic terms, somebody has to fill all that jobs vacuums that are left by deindustrialization of central cities. A lot of that is the service sector. The service sector becomes incredibly reliant on there being a rich real estate sector as a sort of partner. The real estate sector also then gets sort of a great deal of control over setting rents, which then have a great deal of influence over what kinds of businesses can establish in various places. And then finally, there's a spatial vacuum. The literal space that was taken up by industrial capital before is now vacant and open for redevelopment. In a lot of cities, we've seen a big rush of real estate capital into those spaces to turn, factories into lofts, to turn active waterfronts into festival markets and things like that. So I see in my timer that I have taken up about the first half of my my talk to talk about how we got to where we are. I'll just say that in the closing chapter of my book, I lay out 3 kind of sets of ideas about how we might get out of this space. And those are first a set of policies that are, if not necessarily on the political agendas of our leadership, would be, in my parlance, kosher with US constitutional norms and with the general rules of capitalism. So there's a lot that we could be doing right now that we're not doing. And it's maybe not enough to completely flip this dynamic, but it would make a huge dent. And it's important that we don't kind of provide this big picture structural analysis that then lets our planners and politicians off the hook to say, oh yeah, this is a really big 100-year political, economical, geographical shift, and what the hell could I do about it? No, there are many things that could be done about it, which have to do with tax policy, which have to do with zoning policy, which have to do with rent regulation, encouraging a diverse economy, worker ownership of cooperatives and other things that break up the power of real estate in our local economies. Then I set out a number of principles that I think are politically useful in thinking beyond those limitations, which for me are public stewardship of planning, moving beyond the capitalist democracy contradiction and really thinking about what a fully democratic planning vision could look like. Socializing land, which is to say that perhaps we shouldn't think about the land below us, which none of us created, as a thing that should be bought and sold like any other commodity. And finally, bringing back the radical potential of regionalism, which is very popular among planners of various political stripes. But I think of regionalism as a way of breaking out of our silos and breaking down borders that artificially delineate who can plan for what in any given area, and instead think about what the ecological barriers or ecological boundaries are that actually make sense for planning at a larger scale. Finally, I look at the politics of what could set us in that direction, either the policy reforms or the broad principles. I argue that there's a lot of things planners could do, but they don't have the structural power to lead. And anyone, I think, who has worked in a planning department would probably agree with that. And I argue that the real source of power is the latent power of tenants in many cities to sort of collectively bargain in the way that other workers have historically. New York is in some ways unique in this fashion, but we are a majority renter city. And there are many other cities where the proportion of renters is nowhere near its potential power in terms of political organizing, in terms of making collective demands on both real estate capital and on the state. So I'll stop there and transition from capital city into my dissertation, which is titled Labor, Land Use, and the Luxury City, and is the second half of the title of this talk. So labor, land use, and the luxury city. It kind of starts with the proposition that in all social science research, as far as I'm concerned anyway, the researcher has to somehow take into account at least 3 social forces in explaining anything they're trying to explain, which is to say labor, capital, and the state. You can find those in different ways, but they kind of all have to be present for an analysis to make any sense to me. How they do so is a question of emphasis and perspective, as well as ontology and epistemology, but it all has to be there. My book, Capital City, looked primarily at how the local state has been pushed to enrich real estate capital, and therefore was sort of like a state-centered perspective on what's happening with capital. It looked at labor in a couple of ways. First, as a social base for policies. I mentioned that as deindustrialization took place in many cities. Service sector and political sector unions took over as the major labor players instead of industrial unions. And that ended up having an impact on the way cities were planned and for whom. More importantly, I talk about labor as a source of social movements. And specifically, I talk about the tenant movement, which I consider a labor movement in the sense that just about all tenants are workers. And as I'll talk about in a moment, tenants are engaged in a sort of labor that's not often recognized and is certainly rarely compensated. But I talk about that labor movement, the tenant movement, as the key to transforming the existing planning system. My dissertation looks at the same circumstances as the book, the growing concentration of capital into real estate and its long-term impacts on the practice of urban planning, but it does so from the perspective of labor organizations in New York City. So I'm talking about what we generally call organized labor. The first big bucket of organized labor, and sometimes the only one we talk about when we use that term, are unions. Organizations of workers organized at the workplace, usually by sector and geography. So, the hotel workers union represents all the workers in a hotel in a given geography, New York City in my case. That's an industrial union model. You could also have a craft union that represents a certain kind of skilled labor, usually also within a particular location, like a pipe fitters union. Doesn't represent all construction workers, just represents that particular craft. In addition, my dissertation also looks at nonprofits, or specifically working class nonprofits and community-based organizations, as organizations that represent a different kind of labor. And specifically, it's social reproductive labor, cultural production, and the production of space. This is a little abstract, but what I'm arguing is community-based organizations essentially organize working class people based on where they live, their home, their neighborhood, potentially their city. And they are organizing a form of labor. They are organizing the labor that goes into maintaining a household. They're organizing the labor that goes into making a neighborhood what it is. They're organizing the labor that goes into defending folks' right to a place, to a cultural identity, but specifically their right to stay put, as Chester Hartman put it years ago. And so I argue that that's a different form of labor organizing. It's just organizing essentially unpaid labor, but still it's a working class organization. And so therefore, labor is an important actor in the production of urban space, in making cities what they are. But labor is seriously limited in its capacity to make space as it will. Under capitalism, labor is rarely afforded the opportunity to produce space autonomous of capital and the state. Basically, the three are almost always engaged in alliances within and against one another. So what I mean by that is, like I said earlier, I'm talking about labor, capital, and the state, but those are not three homogeneous groups that are sort of like together in themselves and against one another. Instead, each one is fractured. So it's easy to think about the state as fragmented, right? We have federal, state, and local government. We have multiple parties, or at least two of them. We have different agencies that are sometimes working at cross purposes. We have, a welfare state and a warfare state, which are competing for budgetary priorities. So the state is a complicated, fragmented, internally contradictory element. Same with capital. I think leftists probably overstate the claim that capital is this sort of united force, or that it's really good at politically organizing itself. That's sort of true, but if you look a little bit more carefully, you'll see that different elements of capital have different claims on the state, which takes us right back to Fogelsong, arguing that industrial capital and real estate capital not only had different interests, but sometimes directly conflicting interests. That dynamic continues to this day. You also have regional capital fighting against each other, local businesses versus big businesses, all sorts of scales of conflict within this general orbit we might call capital. labor is almost never recognized as fragmented in the same way, except maybe in analyses of race, that we see some racial groups given preference by the state, given preference by capital, or even given preference by labor organizations, historically, especially trade unions and craft unions in particular, having a preference for white workers over workers of color. We also see sometimes analysis of the gender division of labor, the starkest being unpaid versus paid labor, but also pay discrepancies. We should also be thinking about spatial fractures within labor and the working class. Given that capital is mobile, there are often conflicts between workers in one city and workers in another over, who's going to get the jobs. You can think of that as at a global scale in terms of the global race to the bottom for labor standards and the fight against that, which has sometimes been internationalist and sometimes been nationalist in its character. You can also think of that recent debacle, I would say, of Amazon's headquarters, where they encourage cities across the country to compete for who's going to have that headquarters. And what you saw was not just state governments competing and not just local property owners saying, hey, we're here, but also local labor organizations saying, we are ready, willing, and able to build this here, please don't send it there. So you see these fragments across geography. There's another type of fragment that I found particularly important in talking about planning in New York City, which is fragments by sector, as in the construction sector, the service sector, the public sector, have very different needs in terms of planning and very different interests, and therefore very different expressions of their politics around planning. So if we assume that labor is not a coherent, simple group of social forces, but it is instead fractured and fragmented, and we assume the same is true of capital, and we assume the same is true of the state, then when we think about when we think about land use and planning, and I'm looking specifically at New York City, but this part can be generalized to many cities in the United States and beyond. Space is produced through coalitions of elements of labor, elements of capital, and elements of the state working together and at cross purposes with other elements of labor, other elements of capital, and other elements of the state. And they come together to form what I call a spatial strategy, which is similar to what Clyde Woods wrote about with regional planning blocks, and is kind of like Gramsci's idea of a historical block, but this idea that groups of people across class and political divisions will come together to support a particular form of development and a particular form of planning, and fight with other groups of less empowered workers, capitalists, and state actors to see that vision through. And if we bring it back to my concept of the real estate state, then the question is, what is the coalition of a fragment of state power, a fragment of capital, and a fragment of labor that's produced this landscape that I'm describing? And I want to look at it particularly from the landscape, or from the direction of labor, because I think that's the most understudied. It's arguably the most interesting in terms of the obvious problem with creating a more expensive city for working class populations. And it directly relates to my own background. So to give a brief bio, after college and cutting out a bunch of low-wage service jobs here and there, I was a union researcher for the Property Service Workers Union in New York City, representing janitors, security officers, anybody who's working in a non-technical capacity to operate a building. Then I was a planning student. Then I was a tenant organizer. Then I was a PhD student. Again, cutting out a lot of divergent stuff in between. But basically, this is also my story of what I witnessed working in the labor movement, what I witnessed working in the tenant movement, what I witnessed studying planning, and what I witnessed studying geography. And so what I'm most interested is how and why a dynamic has formed in New York City, and I would argue many other places, but that's not where I focused, where New York City's organized labor in the form of unions and working class nonprofits are more likely than not to support land use changes that accelerate gentrification. And that support can be active support, coming out in favor of this land use change, or regulatory framework that accelerates gentrification. It can also be in the form of sort of taking a negotiating stance from the beginning rather than an oppositional stance, essentially negotiating the terms of gentrification rather than opposing it outright. Or, and this is perhaps the most politically interesting dynamic that I've seen the least amount of writing on, opposing these schemes, these gentrification-inducing land use schemes, for the sole purpose of creating a negotiating platform to win something else, after which point they will switch sides and support the political development. So for example, a rezoning is proposed that endangers a working class community. A union might come out strongly against that, but they're actually only using that position to, let's say, get at a landowner in the area who they're fighting because they have a non-union work site someplace else. They're trying to show that developer or that landowner, business owner, whatever, that they can cost them more money by screwing up their rezoning than they can by signing a union contract. Once they have convinced the owner of that fact, they will switch sides and either drop their opposition or actually switch sides and now support the project as good for jobs production or other reasons. I find this dynamic totally fascinating, really disturbing as a person who's tried to work in both unions and tenant organizations, and almost completely ignored in the literature, which tends to present unions and nonprofits in one of two ways: either as working class heroes who can do no wrong, or as these sort of poverty pimp sellouts who are only there to undermine their networks. Those are like the two main ways of seeing things. I guess another way is as tools in the growth machine, which I think is probably empirically right, but way undermines unions' agency in getting to the place that they're at, and also ignores a lot of dynamics that have made unions and nonprofits much more savvy political actors than anything you could usefully describe as a tool in somebody's machine. So in terms of the question, why are unions and nonprofits in New York City kind of lining up with real estate capital on a lot of these planning questions? There's really no simple answer. I could give a couple one-word answers like capitalism or neoliberalism, but that's like basically skirting anybody's responsibility to actually answer the question. You could answer any question that way. And so I ended up with this very long dissertation that tries to answer the question in multiple ways. And so I'll go over a few of those answers and then we'll open it up. And I'm going to focus here on the union side just for expediency and also for the fact that I now work for a nonprofit, which complicates my role in all this. But I'm happy to talk about both in the Q&A. So first, how are unions involved in planning politics? First, by supporting or opposing particular projects, public projects, private projects, anything in between. Second, by supporting or opposing rezonings and other land use actions. Third, by supporting or opposing developer tax breaks or rent regulations that impact planning possibilities and development outcomes. And finally, and maybe most interestingly, with their pension fund investments, which they can put toward all sorts of use, and is a tremendous amount of what some scholars call labor's capital, which can be used to change the dynamics of development in a given place. They engage in planning politics in all sorts of ways. Their members testify at public hearings. They hire technical experts to do planning analyses on their behalf, consultants essentially. They forge community coalitions with other groups that are taking the stance that is strategic for them to take on one of those 4 questions that I laid out before. They can do coordinated turnout like almost no other social actor in terms of bringing their members to a political rally, either in support of or against a particular planning agenda. And a lot of them have pretty savvy media operations that are good at placing stories in the press that quote their members and their leadership as being either supportive or oppositional to a planning agenda. And then behind the scenes, there's a great deal of lobbying, especially in cities where unions are major political donors. In terms of when and where they get involved, it's certainly not that that unions will get involved anywhere there's a fight to be had, and this is kind of why I think it's more interesting than just a pro-growth orientation. They are most likely to get involved in a geographic area with a limited availability of land, basically where a real estate developer has to negotiate with them because there isn't a whole lot of other places that they can go to build a comparable development. They're interested in economic geographies that have low unemployment and high rates of public subsidies. So where labor markets are tight, and where a strike can work, but also where there's a lot of public subsidies, because that's one of the only ways that unions and to some extent nonprofits can intervene in the land use process. They can say, if a development gets a public subsidy, then it has to provide union scale jobs or something like that. You can't just write that into the zoning code, as it's broadly understood to be unconstitutional. In terms of the political terrain, they're looking for areas where they have a generous proportion of local membership. They don't have to be a majority by any stretch, but a big enough group that they can say, our members are directly affected and we can vote you out if you don't vote on this how we want, and where they have existing political relationships. They are also interested in cases where the developers who are who have the most at stake have something that they need. They need public subsidy. They need a PR boost after doing something bad. Maybe they need a rezoning. If the developer needs something, then the union can come in as a kind of kingmaker and negotiate a deal between the developer and the state that works for their members as well, and essentially construct this kind of fragment of labor, fragment of capital, fragment of state coalition that I'm talking about to produce a spatial strategy. What are they hoping to get out of this? Of course, they want, first and foremost, to protect existing union jobs. They want to make sure that the mode of development and planning in the city doesn't undermine their membership. They're more interested in density than anything else. And when they say density, they do not mean the density of housing units per acre. They mean the density of union members within a labor force. That's the density that they care about. If raising or lowering residential density will help them get to that point, they will most likely support the planning change that produces that outcome. But it's like they're talking past each other in this language of density. Of course, they also want to produce future union jobs, but in my interviews, that definitely came up as a secondary impulse after protecting current jobs. They want to create or maintain a market that favors union firms over non-union firms. And this is really interesting because sometimes it means unions supporting the biggest players in their market, which are people that they already had historic fights with and have long-term contracts with. So they might support the big developer over the small one because the small developer makes their money by undermining the union's wage scale. They might support the big business that they have a national contract with over the local mom and pop, even as they use the rhetoric of, supporting thriving neighborhoods or whatever else. Again, this is not to say it's bad. It's just this is what they understand to be in their interest, and it's different than the way we usually think of labor and planning. They seek to hold or gain ground in current or future collective bargaining negotiations, which might mean doing their collective bargaining partner a favor now in order to cash in on that later. So the collective bargaining partner for a public sector union might be the mayor or the governor. The collective bargaining partner for the union that I used to work with, that represented janitors and others in building service, it was the real estate board, the collective body of landlords. And so sometimes unions will support the planning agenda that their collective bargaining partner supports in order to curry favor them, or they will reject it in order to ramp up tensions if they're not seeing their bargaining partner as bargaining in good faith. And then finally, and again, probably the least talked about factor, they have a fiduciary duty to their retirees. So unions have pension funds. Those pension funds are invested in ways that are somewhat beyond the union's control. This is especially true after the mid-70s changes in the regulation of how unions can use pension funds, which limited their ability to do things like invest largely in large-scale social housing production, which is a thing that New York City unions used to do. At this point, that is considered an irresponsible financial move, whereas investing in private equity firms that are going to buy out low-income housing is seen as a very smart financial move and benefits their retirees' pension funds. The disgusting irony, of course, is that it may also result in union pension recipients being evicted from their homes. And we've seen that play out directly in New York. We've seen it the most in California, where the public sector pension is one of the largest institutional investors in the country, invested in Blackstone. Blackstone evicted a bunch of retirees out of an Oakland complex, which included all these public sector workers who had retired. So they are seeing their pension values soar by evicting their very pension members. So this creates all sorts of dynamics that cut across any simple notion of a class working for itself. So there's a high degree of class consciousness here. The unions know what they're doing and see themselves as working for their fragment of the class, but not necessarily a broader degree of class consciousness. And certainly they don't see a capacity for collective action at the scale of the working class in general. And so instead there's this move to make planning deals that benefit their sort of sector of labor. So I apologize, I've gone long here, but I think my dissertation kind of complicates some of the work that I did in Capital City and shows that if we are to change this, we're going to have a really big question of how does the existing system work for some of the most politically powerful segments of the working class, and how would we have to change that in order to bring them on in partners in an anti-gentrification urban planning agenda. So I will end there. I would love to hear your questions about the first half about the book, the second half about the dissertation, and then about the giant elephant in the room, which is that everything has changed in the last 5 months since I graduated and finished this dissertation. So look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. That was really fascinating. So why don't those who have questions do the hand raise function? We'll try it that way. Or butt in, just unmute and ask a question. Questions from folks? It's hard for me to see the question thing, so.
If you also wanted to post in the chat, if that would be easier for anyone, you could do that as well.
Okay. Would you monitor the chat, Brittany? And pass on the questions that show up there? Okay, questions?
I
Sean.
have. Thank you for speaking, Sam. When you mentioned rejecting rezonings to elicit better political outcomes, how do people fight against the argument that the cost and time to the developer will then be passed off to these low-income people, and in the end, the benefits might not be worth all that extra time, that sort of thing? Because I've dealt with some planning outcomes where people don't necessarily understand the political outcome that these groups are fighting for when they are against these political projects.
Right, right. And so some of what I'm doing with this dissertation work is like saying the quiet part loud. So when I have represented unions in the past, and I've been involved in rezoning actions of the variety you're talking about, you are forced to say a lot more about every other issue than the one you actually care about. So what we really care about is collective bargaining agreements and union density, but that's not a thing that planning commissions are empowered to care about. And so instead, we would either hire a planning consultant or do the work ourselves to come up with some planning-based reason to fight back against a rezoning. And often we would do that in coalition with other organizations. And this was the most personally difficult part for me, because you enter into this coalition with groups that are against a rezoning or for a rezoning for transparent political reasons. They're for or against it for the reason that they say, whereas you as the union representative will join and amplify their voices tremendously because we have the resources to do so, but ultimately we want a different outcome. And if the union's demands are met, we may suddenly disappear and may end up on the other side. And so, you know, the sort of ethical dilemma was, what do you say to your coalition partners at the beginning? And what the spiel usually was, listen, we're going to be in this for as long as works for us. And at one point, we might need to back away. And I think that is maybe hard to assimilate if you don't know what it means from like the community-based organization perspective that's on the other side of that coalition. So I think we all need to be a little bit more cognizant of the real politic of labor participation in urban planning. I actually think that should be a part of planning education, not to be cynical of folks who are presenting their case in planning hearings, but to understand that motivations are probably much more complicated than what fits into a 2-minute comment period. And so I would like to see a broader discussion of these dynamics in an academic setting when we're training planners, but also in a political setting. And I'd like there to be more honesty within these coalitions around that. And so that might take some of the other coalition members asking pointed questions of a large and well-resourced organization that joins the coalition of what exactly are you hoping to get out of this? And what would be the consequence to us if you get what you need, but we don't get what we need? But there's also, I should say, a counter trend, which is the trend of what we call bargaining for the common good, which is a framework that a lot of union reformers are pushing, trying to get unions to have more of a kind of double bottom line around what they're fighting for, and incorporating community concerns into collective bargaining. The most clear examples of this were the way that the Chicago Teachers Union and the LA Teachers Union, when they went on strike last year, incorporated a lot of the parents' demands into their demands, including demands around housing. And they said, look, if our students and their parents are being evicted or going homeless, we cannot be expected to do our jobs. I cannot teach a student who can't go home to do their homework. And so my students' housing conditions are my working conditions. That level of kind of inter-issue class-conscious unionism, I think, is really the direction we could go in to change this. Short of that, or in the meantime, I think it's good that planners and community activists who aren't involved in this have a better political sense of how unions operate and why. And then on the flip side of that, how nonprofits operate and why.
Thanks. Other questions?
We have one in the chat. So Haijing wants to know, are there any heterogeneities that you observe between different types of unions or community-based organizations in terms of responding to planning issues?
Absolutely. And those heterogeneities can cut across multiple fields. So let me stick to unions for now, because that's what I talked about in this talk. So I mentioned earlier that sectoral differences are really important. Service sector, industrial sector, building trades, construction sector, and public sector being the most salient divisions. They're structured differently, they have different interests, and so they can end up on different sides of things. Historically, building trades unions have been kind of, I would say, stereotyped as these kind of hard hat, pro-growth, if you want to build it, let's do it, partners in the growth machine. What's interesting is that in my empirical findings, I actually found that the building trades are going through a bit of soul searching right now because they've been so cut out of high-end development in New York City that they are no longer treated, they feel, with respect by the industry partners that they've been flogging for politically for generations. And so it's actually the building trades locals who are considered to be, traditionally the most conservative, who are doing the community partnerships, demanding, if rezonings go forward, that there's a real commitment to low-income housing, for example. And with that comes subsidies, and with the subsidies comes the opportunity to attach a wage rider. So the construction unions are actually being kind of progressive right now. A union that has the reputation of being the most progressive on issues that don't directly reflect their bread and butter is the union that I used to work for, the Service Employees International Union, which is out in front on questions of immigration, farm labor. They do all sorts of great things in New York City and beyond, but they have been the partner of the real estate industry on some really crucial things, and they have written into their contract, into the contract of the union that I used to work for since 2011, so 2 years after I stopped working there, a partnership with the real estate board that says we will not lobby for anything that's bad for the other partner, and we will do our lobbying collectively. So when they were interviewing mayoral candidates to endorse, it was the real estate board and the ostensibly most progressive union in America making a collective decision about who they would endorse. When there was a dramatic surge of tenant activity last year, that very union was basically on the other side saying, well, let's not go too far with this whole rent regulation thing. We want to make sure that the landlords get enough income in rent to pay our workers what they deserve. So there are these fragments around sector. I'll say quickly that it's certainly different by geography. Even within sector, a local representing different parts of any city is going to be different. There's historical differences, whether a union came out of the AFL or the CIO, for example. New York City, almost every active union came out of the AFL, which has a more conservative political tradition. In other cities, the CIO unions are more dominant, and there's a bit more of a fighting force there. So yes, there's a ton of heterogeneity, and I think that's part of the project I'm working on in theorizing that heterogeneity and saying labor is always internally differentiated. It is never one thing. Just like we understand the state and capital to be fragmented, we should understand labor to be that way. And that is a source of both weakness and strength.
Other questions?
All right, we have some more in the chat.
Okay.
So Seth would like to know, what is your take on the differences for nonprofits, and perhaps especially nonprofits which work directly or are funded directly by municipalities?
Yeah, so there's a whole second half of my dissertation about nonprofits that looks at the kind of war on poverty onward trend of public support for nonprofit organizations, direct or indirect, which then end up taking on a lot of the functions of the local and, maybe even larger state. And we can see that especially in housing, where we've seen a very large retreat from public housing. The budgets have been cut tremendously over the years, and there's a moratorium on the construction of new public housing. So almost all low-income housing that gets built at this point is built via nonprofit organizations through a kind of money laundering scheme whereby the federal government creates tax credits, which it gives to state governments, which go to nonprofits, which are sold to for-profit entities. And basically, this is as good a depiction of any as A, the real estate state, and B, the coalition of labor, state, and capital forces that are used in creating urban space. So nonprofits are really important in municipal politics. I found their recent record in New York City to be a little bit more politically bold than the unions more recently. But going back a few years before the turn, and I can explain maybe why that turn happened, there was a conservative trend, and it has to do in part with what you brought up, which is funding. If their funding comes from the governments that they're seeking to lobby, then they have to be careful in how they do that. And if their funding comes from large foundations that are basically financed by the richest people in the world, then the idea of taking on the richest people in the world is suddenly a dangerous proposition as well. So funding is a key issue. But there are others as well, including they provide such crucial social service supports that the state is not functioning, that the state is not providing, that they really need to be there and exist into the future in order to provide those services. And development streams can be a way of doing that, which sometimes involves creating temporarily affordable housing, which can be sold off at market rates after 15 or 30 years. That can include close relationships with funders, as I mentioned before. It can also just include trying to benefit from a rising real estate climate, either through direct investments or partnerships with real estate developers where a for-profit development gets built and then a nonprofit contractor gets hired to manage a small amount of affordable housing on the site or to run a jobs program or something like that. In New York City, when public land is put toward private use, basically the bylaws require that there be a combination of a for-profit entity and a nonprofit entity that makes a bid on building out that space. So how can the nonprofits then be against the real estate industry if they have to be in coalition with them in order to win bids? So all of these forces can act as a conservatizing force on the nonprofit sector. Though I will say in the last few years, we've seen some surprising political turns in New York City. I think emboldened by a new reform electoral wind that has changed people's ideas of what's possible, as well as a pretty deep disillusionment in the mayor and his capacity to change the dynamics of housing despite his promises.
Okay. Other questions?
We have another chat question. So Victoria would like to know, thinking specifically about recent auto union leaders who were charged with corruption, do you find there are union leaders who might be contributing to the real estate state deliberately for profit?
Yeah, did you say auto unions, like car? Yeah. Yes. So I think I made a decision in my dissertation to discount two possible explanations, one of which was ignorance and the second of which was direct corruption, which is not to say that neither of those things happen, but rather to say that if we assume that both of them happen some of the time, why else does this continue to happen? So, the first one, ignorance, basically not assuming that they don't know what they're doing, always assuming that this is a strategic decision among limited choices and choices that are structurally limited. And then around the corruption question, yeah, there really are corrupt union and nonprofit leaders. Probably in every city we could point to a few. There's a writer who I cite a lot in my work named Robert Fitch, who wrote 2 books about New York City planning and development politics. The first one is about landowners and planners, and then the second one is about union corruption. And he lays out some specific schemes where unions who had either organized crime affiliations or other problems were investing in real estate, pursuing real estate friendly politics, and then reaping the rewards. So, buying out land, supporting an upzoning on that land, and then selling it off without having built anything in a purely speculative way. So does that exist? Yes. I did not find, and it also came up in my interviews with union staffers and leaders, but never as the dominant explanation. And it could be naivete, but I really don't think that it's enough of an explanation, but it shouldn't be discounted.
Okay, we have another question as well from Tom. who asks, do you think comprehensive rezoning proposals like in Minneapolis or Austin would have a positive impact on housing shortages?
Yeah, and by comprehensive, you mean like abolishing single-family zoning, that kind of thing? Yeah, I don't see any need to have single-family zoning. I don't think that it, in and of itself, uh, addresses many of the other issues that I've brought up, but I found myself being a little bit more careful about how my arguments get used since writing this book. And I will use this as a cautionary tale to anybody who wants to do public-facing publication, which is that you can write what you mean, and it will never prevent somebody from misusing it consciously or unconsciously. And the most egregious example of this that I've heard of is the mayor of Beverly Hills, California, literally raising my book in his hand at a regional planning meeting at which a friend of mine was advocating for more dense and low-income housing in exclusionary suburbs, saying, everyone has to read this book. It'll tell you why more housing is not the solution. I never said that. And I specifically said, we need to rethink the way that we do these rezonings so that they don't disproportionately impact low-income neighborhoods. And instead, we break up the high-income clusters so that we're focused less on concentration of poverty than concentration of affluence. That's the problem. And so if undoing single-family zoning helps us get there, great. I would love for it to be paired with something else that helps make it so that we're not just adding supply, but we're doing something to make that new supply match need. At least in, it can be flexible, it can be different in different areas, whatever. And also to make sure that we don't get a situation where homeowners in the wealthiest neighborhoods can afford to keep their lots single-family home, whereas there ends up being intense speculative pressure on homeowners in working class areas where they're getting bombarded with developer, solicitations to sell. Maybe they fall behind on their water bill. Suddenly there's a tax lien on their property. And very soon a developer can come in, get them out of their home, knock it down, build two. Did we double the density on that lot? Yes. Is that a good thing? Not in this case. We just kicked out a working class family from their home. So I see no reason not to do this kind of thing. I also see reason to pair it with other things. And as long as I've been writing about zoning and inclusionary zoning and upzoning, I've always said, better to do it as a blanket over the entire city than pick a few neighborhoods and make it a neighborhood by neighborhood fight. And where you can do it, you can also mandate, inclusionary zoning without giving away the store to developers by, creating tremendous amounts of value that is then not recaptured. And so whether that's through a land value tax, whether that's through a much more aggressive form of inclusionary zoning, or even, as some cities have done, instituting inclusionary zoning without an upzoning, saying you're allowed to build 5 units here. We're not saying you can now build 20. We're just saying 1 or 2 of them in the future have to be set aside for income targeted. Landlords have threatened to sue on that. I have yet to see a successful lawsuit stopping that kind of program.
Additional questions?
Okay, so we have some more in our chat.
Okay.
So Kayla says, I'd love to hear about your take on the effects of the pandemic on the real estate state. She says, I keep seeing articles about commercial vacancies and lower rents in some markets, but home sales in her neighborhood are hotter than ever.
Yes, right. So we've seen a narrative and counter narrative in the media where the first narrative was, oh my God, cities are terrible, everybody's leaving cities. The counter narrative then was, maybe not, maybe it's just pent up demand from 4 months of not having suburban home sales. Let's see how this goes in a little bit. So I'm definitely with the sober second side of things. There are areas where housing markets have cooled down dramatically. Within New York City, which I think is, people like to say it's exceptional. I think it's telling. Manhattan's way over bloated real estate market has taken a cut significantly. Most of that cut is at the very high end of properties that were already not selling and now are having an even harder time selling. A not very careful analysis can see, those properties dropping by hundreds of thousands of dollars in their sales price, and then aggregate that or spread that over the entire market as if all sales prices were coming down, when really it's actually a subset. In the neighborhoods that got the hardest hit by the coronavirus in New York City, which are overwhelmingly low income, majority people of color, and places where people could not socially distance, both because they were working throughout the pandemic and because they were living in overcrowded housing conditions, we have seen the exact same housing trends we saw before. The rents continue to go up. People are not moving. There are no options to move into. Rents are going up, and wages, if anything, have gone down, except for the small number of workers, or not small, but temporary number of workers whose minimum wages were supplemented by a now non-existent federal program. So I think what we're going to see is another great divergence, but in a different direction. We're going to see an intensive housing crunch in the most hard-struck neighborhoods, and we might see a softening of the real estate market in the neighborhoods that were most protected, which is not going to then translate into an immediate filtering of people from these low-income neighborhoods into these high-income neighborhoods, because we don't have 30 years to do it, and for all sorts of other reasons as well. So I think it's going to be tough. My work now as a housing policy analyst includes several projects on this front. One is a report that should be coming out at the end of this month, co-authored with 3 other analysts, looking at the likelihood of a landlord foreclosure crisis in New York State, New York City, but beyond, and how there is, on the one hand, a bunch of hedge fund jerks who are lining up to buy out either the debt or the buildings and make a killing off of this. But on the other hand, there are policy mechanisms that could allow the city and state to intervene and transfer those buildings into some form of cooperative ownership, which is a model that we've done in the past. We've never done it with as overinflated a property market as we have right now. So it's a very expensive proposition, but it's not unthinkable. So that's one project I'm working on. I'm also looking at the possibility of converting hotels into long-term low-income housing, essentially modified single-room occupancy, retrofitted to have at least private bathrooms and hopefully private kitchens. Surprisingly, maybe, there is a great deal of interest from the hotel industry, which says we've lost all our income for 5 months and don't see it coming back anytime soon. There is, of course, a lot of opposition from privileged folks who don't want a bunch of low-income people suddenly living in their nice hotels. And we just saw a major victory from those jerks in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, who convinced the mayor to shut down what was a very useful transformation of a hotel into essentially a single-room homeless shelter, and is now putting 300 single men into very dangerous position. So that's the work that I'm doing on that front. Well, okay, so I said at the beginning of this pandemic, I would avoid making predictions. I think I've made a few now, but I still stick by, we really don't know what's coming until at least November 3rd, and probably for a while after.
Okay, maybe one more question and then.
We do have more in the chat.
Okay, well.
Go ahead.
I'll do a lightning round. I'll do very short answers.
Okay, there are 2, so hopefully we can get through them.
Okay.
So Joshua says, you mentioned Vancouver a handful of times. Could you elaborate a little on the Canadian real estate state?
Sure. I had the, honor of being invited to go to Vancouver and do a couple events with the Vancouver Tenants Union. And they, while there are differences between the US and Canadian model, saw a lot of resonance in what I was writing about in the US and in New York specifically in Vancouver. What's been called the Vancouver model was an attempt to build out large amounts of very high-end real estate for temporary use, which would in turn bring in tax revenue, which could then be used toward funding social housing. And like most trickle-down models, those at the bottom are saying, what the hell, this isn't working. So there's still a tremendous amount of homelessness in that community, a tremendous amount of rent burden, and of now low-income housing being bought out by the same institutional actors that are building the high-income housing. So it seems a cautionary tale.
Okay, final question.
All right. So Courtney says the concept of socializing land seemed very, very progressive to me. Do you see a future where that could happen?
It's not easy, right? I mean, this is a US Constitution enshrined in the idea of private property, a lot of which is private land ownership. But we should acknowledge that we do have social owning of a lot of land already. Think of the streets. Who owns the streets? Public owns the streets. Public buildings are publicly owned. Public housing, to the extent it still exists in places, is publicly owned. Parks are publicly owned. If you amalgamated all of that publicly owned land in a city, you might find that it's a very large percent of the actual space. And so I would encourage us to think a little bit more creatively about what is already socialized land, and then to think about the dynamics of how that came to be, which is not a pretty picture. I wrote an article or a pair of articles about this with my now coworker, Oksana Mironova, where we looked at the dynamics of what we called municipalization and privatization of land, how cities have taken control, have taken possession land, and how they've privatized land that has gone into their hands. So I would encourage folks to do that. We did it for New York and Newark, New Jersey. I would encourage folks to think about, how has that happened in Austin? How much land is in public control? How did it come to be that way? Which elements of that would we want to reproduce into the future? And which elements of that do we want to cast into the dustbin of history?
Okay, I think we're going to have to let this guy go. It was really a fascinating talk. I'm definitely going to scrounge around and see if I can find your dissertation.
Oh, it's embargoed, but I can email it to
Okay.
anybody who's interested.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I like to look at it when it's available.
Sure.
It sounds like a great extension and kind of maybe complication of the book. So thanks a lot. It was really a great talk. Thanks for everybody. We had, at a peak, we had 60 participants. So great turnout. And thanks so much, Sam.
My
Thanks.
pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.